This is our 7th lecture for lifespan development in social work, and we're going to be focusing on language development. So, what are the fundamentals of language? Basically, language moves from making sounds, those are the kinds of sounds that we hear infants and babies making, to actually creating sounds that are recognizable into what we call words, or basically symbols that are formed by sounds. Language is the systematic, meaningful arrangement of symbols and provides the basis for communication. Language has several formal characteristics that must be mastered as linguistic competence is developed. So children need to be able to do or to be able to master and show competence in all of the following. And these are all listed here on the slide. First is phonology, and that refers to the basic sounds of language called phonemes. And these, when these are combined, they produce recognizable words and also recognizable sentences, so that others understand what those sounds the person is making. Then there's morphemes, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing these words. Morphemes are the smallest language unit that has meaning, and we'll get into that a little bit further in this lecture. There are semantics, and these are the rules that govern the meaning of words and sentences. Basically, semantics, one of the main aspects of semantics is what we call grammar. It's the kind of the rules that we follow in stringing words together so that they have meaning across people when we're talking, and then across time when people may be reading a document written from somebody in the past. Language is closely tied to the way infants think and how they understand the world. The research shows us that as children develop a greater proficiency in language, their understanding of the world improves, or increases, I should say. Linguistic comprehension is the understanding of speech, and linguistic production is the use of language to communicate. Comprehension precedes production. That's a very important thing to understand. Even when people learn languages later in their lives, comprehension always precedes production. Okay, so now we're talking about infants. They show what is called pre-linguistic communication through sounds, through facial expressions, grins, grimaces, gestures, imitations of those who try to communicate with them, and other non-linguistic means or linguistic techniques, non-linguistic, I should say, techniques. Babbling. Babbling is well known by most people. This is when infants make speech-like but meaningless sounds at about 2 to 3 months of age, and they continue to do this for about a year. Babbling is a universal phenomenon. This is something that we see across all cultures for all infants. Babbling usually begins with very easy sounds. At least in the English language, it's the B, the B sound, and the P, the P sound, and then proceeds to more complex sounds such as D for D and T for T. By the age of about 6 months, babbling differs according to the language to which the infant is exposed. So it's interesting that before 6 months of age, one can listen to babbling and basically not really recognize which country or language the mother language of that child will be. But after 6 months, you start noticing a difference. That is, children begin to start making differentiation. Their sounds, their babbling becomes more differentiated based on their mother language. Infants who cannot hear and are exposed to sign language, this is a very interesting finding, babble with their hands instead of with their voices. I didn't know this, actually, until I read this text. But infants still show babbling. They may not hear, be able to hear. They may not be able to produce sounds in the more typical way that we would expect from children infants who can hear or have that facility. But if you start you start using sign language with infants, they babble in sign language as well. The first words are generally spoken between 10 and 14 months of age. By about 15 months, the average child has a vocabulary of about 10 words. The one-word stage ends around 18 months. What they mean by that is that children will use only one word to communicate to others. Between the ages of about 16 to 24 months of age, a child's vocabulary explodes from about 10 to 50 words to 400 words. So we start to see now the beginning, this kind of ramping up, this acceleration of a child's ability to learn new words and more words at a faster rate. It is hypothesized that this is due to that, remember when we talked about this earlier in the semester, that fine-tuning of the brain, where the brain continues to grow, develop, and all those undifferentiated cells that are there waiting to be used begin to differentiate further and further based on the demands of the environment placed on the child and on the interactions that the child has with the environment, including others. So the brain begins to basically hardwire itself, if you will, to learn and produce language and comprehend language. First words typically are label words. That is, these are labels that are used for objects or people, regularly present in the baby's life. So this basically means that children learn nouns first, typically, before other words. First words are typically what they call hollow phrases, as you'll see there. These are one-word utterances that depend on the particular context in which they are used to determine meaning. The most famous, what do you think the most famous hollow phrase is that children use? We even, there's even a period of time where we kind of growth, I should say, based on what we call the terrible twos, because of a certain hollow phrase that they use over and over again. And if you don't know what it is, I'll tell you. No! That's a famous, I don't know if it's a well-loved, but a famous hollow phrase, I should say, that children use. There are cultural differences, and these are revealed in vocabulary development, such as the age at which children use nouns. Now, I just said that children use nouns typically first. That tends to be specific to children whose mother language is English. Let's see. Okay, first sentences are formed when around 18 months. Infants begin to link words together to make a meaning. These typically occur, these simple sentences convey a single thought. So that's an important idea here, is not only are children using single words, but even when they string words together, it's a single thought that they're expressing. And this begins around 18 to 12 months after they say their first word. This linguistic advance allows children to label and then indicate relations between the things that are in their world. So most early sentences are observations about events that occur, that the child witnesses and sees. And a lot of times these are events that occur consistently or regularly on a repetitive basis, at least with the first initial sentences that children express. Now, there are linguistic inaccuracies during this period of time. Of course, there's linguistic inaccuracies throughout our entire life, throughout the entire life cycle, but there are specific kinds of, or unique kinds of inaccuracies that occur during this period of life. And this is what they call telegraphic speech, which occurs when words not critical to the message are left out. So we have what is called underextension. So we use children use words too restrictively. Okay, so let's say they refer to one cat as a cat, but if they see another cat which looks slightly differently from the first cat, they might not extend using the word cat to include both cats. Okay, they use it restrictively in that case. Or sometimes children use it do what is called overextension, where they use words too broadly. So let's go back to the word cat. They'll use cat for those two cats that I just mentioned to you, cat A and cat B, but then they'll also use it for a dog. So they overextend the use of the term. Now, when we get into preschool, we see this amazing extension or advances in language development. So, between the ages of 2 and 3, sentence length increases, as does meaning. Okay? Syntax, remember I already mentioned this previous. This is the way words and phrases are used so as to combine sentences that have meaning. This use of syntax doubles each month during this period of time. So again, now we're starting to see a ramping up of language ability, acquisition, comprehension, etc. There are enormous leaps in the number of words that children use and children learn, so that by the age of 6, a typical child's vocabulary is around 14,000 words. Now remember, at the previous stage, we were saying around 500. So we're talking about a matter of about 3 or 4 years that a child's vocabulary can develop from 500 words max to 14,000 words. And this is required, this rate of acquisition is nearly a new word every 2 hours, 24 hours a day. Now, the kids are not actually learning a new word every 2 hours. Ding! 2 hours are done, now let's learn a new word. It's not quite that way. But on average, if you were to spread it out across that whole time of acquiring 14,000 words, it would be as if they were learning a new word every 2 hours, every 24 hours. Children manage this feat through a process known as fast mapping. And what that is that these are instances in which new words are associated with their meaning after only a brief encounter. So children are able, firstly, to see the word, learn the word, and rapidly remember what the meaning of the word is. By age 3, for example, children use plurals. They use possessive forms of nouns such as boys. This is the boy's hat, for example. They start to employ the past tense. They use articles such as a and the. And they can ask and answer complex questions such as, where did you say my book is? Believe it or not, that's a complex sentence for a child, especially when you look back at what we were talking about, infants and toddlers. So it's incredible that children are able to develop these kinds of skills very quickly. Preschoolers also begin to acquire the principles of grammar. Now, previously I associated syntax with grammar, and technically they are separate things. But syntax is the basis of grammar. And grammar is the system of rules that determine how our thoughts can be expressed, how certain specific meanings can be expressed in a way that others can understand it. Children also grow in their pragmatic use of language. That is, they're able to use language in a way that communicates effectively and efficiently so that others understand what they are saying in a relatively short matter of time. They can ask a simple question, where did you say my book is? And the other person will understand that immediately. Okay? So this ability permits children not only to be able to express themselves, but understand other people who are expressing in similar ways and in even more complex ways. Okay, so a child develops this ability, that comprehension, that they are able, I should say, they're able to produce more complex ideas, and therefore people then express even more complex ideas to them, which means then children have the opportunity to comprehend even more complex ideas. Children also start to show what is called private speech and also social speech. Most of us, when we think about speech, we think of it as a social engagement. But private speech is speech that is used by children that is spoken directly to them. That is, they're able to start talking to themselves. This also demonstrates their cognitive their cognitions have clearly advanced, so that children know enough that they can talk to themselves and think to themselves at the same time. So this is an advancement, a real, I would say, elegant advancement in both cognitive abilities and linguistic abilities. Private speech allows children to practice conversation, believe it or not. When a child converses with him or herself, when they converse with themselves, they're able to improve their ability to converse with others. Vygotsky argued that private speech facilitates children's thinking, and that private speech helps children to control their behavior, solve problems, and really importantly, reflect on what they're doing and what they have done. And if you think about it, even as adults, when we talk to ourselves, typically it has one of these qualities, aspects to it, if not all of them. It helps us in our thinking. It may help us to control our behavior. It may help us to solve problems, and it certainly is used to reflect. Okay? 20 to 60% of what children say, by the way, during this period of time is private speech. So quite a bit of it is private speech, and you may want to think about how much of what you say is private and how much of it is social speech. And of course, social speech is any speech that is directed towards another person and is meant to be understood by that person. Okay? And of course, just like private speech, social speech advances. Now, language during middle childhood or older childhood, we're talking about around 6 to 7 years of age to about 11 or 12 years of age, continues, of course, to increase exponentially, and we really see a mastering of the language now during this period of time. Vocabulary increases during the school years. School-age children begin to master grammar. Believe it or not, even if you did flunk grammar or English class when you were in high school, you did master grammar on some basic level. And this starts to occur in older childhood. Certain units of sound or phonemes remain troublesome, however. Ja, va, ha, za. These are difficult sounds, and these could continue to be difficult to pronounce for older children. Older children may have difficulty decoding sentences when the meaning depends on intonation or the tone of the voice. So children at this age still tend to have some problems with innuendo, with irony, with a certain tone that is used. They may not pick up on the tone. They just hear the words and the concrete meaning of the word, but the tone might give it a slight different meaning, and sometimes they miss that kind of information. Children, however, do become more competent in their use of pragmatics. That is, the rules governing the use of language to communicate in social context. That is, their social speech improves exponentially during this period of time. Okay, so where does language come from? There's all sorts of theories. We've already talked about that there is a universality of language, especially in those early phases of babbling and gurgling. There seems to be a real universality about how children, infants I should say, babble, gurgle, use that pre-linguistic noises or sounds. So there seems to be some hard wiring there, but nonetheless, it is still not clear how children acquire language. There are several, I should say, and we're only going to really look at two of them, the learning theory approach and the nativist approach. What is meant by the learning theory approach? This posits that language acquisition follows the basic laws of reinforcement and conditioning. That is, children learn through observation, children learn through being rewarded, either through attention or reinforcement from those around them. Through the process of shaping, children's language becomes more and more similar to adults' speech. So children are initially rewarded for hollow phrases. Then as children become a bit more, have a bit more ability, they start using 2 or 3 word sentences, then children are rewarded for these more complex sentences, and on it goes. As children learn more vocabulary, children are rewarded and given praise for using new words, expanding their vocabulary. So this is a form or a process of shaping. This theory does not explain, however, how children learn to speak properly and correctly regarding grammar. It does not explain how children produce novel phrases, sentences, and constructions, such as nonsense words, still using correct grammar. That is, when children are rather novel in how they use language, this approach, that is the learning theory approach, has trouble explaining that. An alternative theory is the nativist approach, which proposes that there's a genetically determined innate mechanism that directs language development. And I kind of hinted to that earlier when I first introduced the slide. This was first proposed by Noam Chomsky. Chomsky argues that all the world's languages share a similar underlying structure called what he calls universal grammar. The brain is hardwired with a language acquisition device, as he calls it, or an LAD. Not that there's an actual device there, but he's using this metaphorically to explain that there's some process, some connectivity, specificity in the brain that allows or creates a neural system within the brain that then permits the understanding and use of language. Support for Chomsky's approach comes from recent findings which identify a specific gene which is related to speech production. Recent research also suggests that infants and adults' speech processing is very similar, and this suggests that there is some evolutionary and underlying basis for language. However, as with most theories, there are critics, and critics argue that since primates can be taught to talk, the uniqueness of human linguistic capacity is called into question. That is, when Chomsky first introduced this idea, he thought it was specific to the human species, and now we know that in fact other species can be trained at least in some very basic skills of communicating. Critics also suggest that although humans may be genetically primed to use language, social experience must be accounted for, that it's not purely a genetic process. Theorists argue that neither learning theory nor this nativist theory fully explains language acquisition. So there's this now what is called interactionist perspective, which suggests that language development is produced through a combination of genetically predetermined predisposition and environmental events. Sound familiar, doesn't it? Sounds familiar. We've been kind of talking about this pretty much the entire semester, and guess what? We will continue to talk about this for the rest of the semester, that human behavior often is a combination of genetics, biology, as well as the physical and social environment. Okay, so language and cognition, or language and thoughts. How are these related? Language shapes thought. Language influences thought. And thoughts then influence language. As you can see, I've created this kind of, it's really meant to be kind of a feedback loop, but the way the slide permitted me to do it didn't quite work that way. But you see thoughts, then language, then more thoughts. Benjamin Lee Whorf argued in the very early 1900s that cultural experiences and language lead children to have different vocabularies. That is, based on the cultural environment that a child is brought up in and the main language the child is exposed to, that will influence the kind of vocabulary that a child has, which then influences the kind of thoughts or ways of interpreting the world. So, for example, Eskimo children have a much richer vocabulary around snow-related experiences. Yeah? Whereas with the English language, we have one word, snow. Whorf's notion, which is also known as the linguistic relativity hypothesis, posits that language shapes and may determine the way people of a given culture perceive, understand, and think about the world. So, based on this notion, the idea is that language shapes thought, but also thought shapes language. So, for example, others have argued that while language can cause particular thoughts, it is also possible that thoughts produce specific language. That's why I said this could be kind of like a feedback loop. So this view, this idea that thought shapes language, believes that thinking shapes language in a consistent way, which is similar to what Piaget might have imagined language being, that there's kind of the cognitions develop on their own way, and because of an improved cognitive ability, that shapes language. And of course, guess where we're going with this? Thoughts and language influence each other. Whoa! Sound familiar? Vygotsky, in fact, argued that through language and thinking, argued that although language and thinking develop independently, they are intimately intertwined and influence each other on an ongoing basis. And I think most linguists would probably argue, and most developmentalists and researchers would argue that that is the case with language. So, let's talk about, so to speak, language and speaking, and especially speaking to and with children. It's very interesting that adults shift their language based on the age of the child. There's also a shift in language based on the age of the adult. We start seeing that particularly with older adults when we talk about elder speak, which is almost somewhat similar to this kind of infant-directed speech as well. But I'm kind of going off course a little bit there. Infant-directed speech is a kind of speaking that is obviously directed towards infants, that is characterized by very short and simple sentences on the part of the individual using it. So, this is kind of typical of infant-directed speech. The pitch of the voice becomes higher, the intonation becomes varied. Even though the sentences are simple, the intonation varies across those simple sentences. There's repetition of words. There's repetition of certain sentences, very simple sentences. Topics are restricted to very concrete items. There are amusing sounds, not just the use of words, but the adult might even babble and imitate the child, the infant. There's very little formal structure to the grammar. The grammar is very simple. And this kind of infant-directed speech typically is used only during the first year of a child's life. As soon as a child begins to show more adult qualities or more mature qualities in their speech, adults begin to shift their speech to reflect that improvement, that advanced stability on the part of the child. Nonetheless, even with older children, I should say preschool children, not necessarily older children, preschool children, this is between from first about 1 year of age, 2 years of age, toddlers to about 4 to 5 year olds, 6 year olds, we still see that adults will at times engage in slower and more deliberate speech with children. The pitch may still vary. The use of the grammar may still be simpler. The sentence structure may be simpler. Although all of these begin to advance more and more with the improvement or with the increase of the ability of the child. Okay. So, is infant-directed speech similar across all cultures? Is there a universality to this? Since, of course, we know from research that especially in those first 4 months of life, infants are pretty universal in what they do with speech, with sounds, etc. Cross-cultural similarities in infant-directed speech are so great, according to the literature, that they appear in some facets of language specific to a particular type of interaction. So, for example, mothers with their infants pretty much use the same kind of infant-directed speech, whether they are speaking in English, the mother language of the mother is English, German, or Mandarin. It's that universal. Now, there are some stylistic differences related to cultural factors, and these seem to exist when gender is considered as a factor. So that's a very interesting notion. So, for example, parents are more apt to respond differently to children's requests depending on whether the child is a boy or a girl. The adults or the parents tend to use a firmer language with boys and a warmer language with girls. Also, there is no conclusive evidence that this language association influences later language style. What I mean by that is, although there is this universality, yes, we've already talked about that, particularly in the first year of life. There is this difference, however, as to how boy infants and girl infants are spoken to. Boys are a bit firmer, our adults are more firm in their language, and with girls they tend to be warmer in their language, and that tends to be somewhat universal as well. But research does not show that men then only use firm language when they're older, and women only use warm kind of expressing themselves. It's very clear, even by older childhood, that children are able to engage in both styles of speaking, even though as infants there tends to be this pattern of speech between adults and their children based on gender. Okay, now I also wanted to add, and this is also included in the readings, I wanted to emphasize this, that there is a link in the literature between language development and poverty and impoverishment. The language children hear at home influences their language development. That's just a universal. Whatever the child is exposed to at home, that's the language or the style in which the child will communicate. I mean, that's how children learn their mother language, okay? But in 1995, there was a very interesting study done by Hart and Risley, and this has since been replicated, that shows the effects of poverty on language. Economic level, they found, was a significant factor, was significantly related to the amount of parental interactions that a child receives. So the amount of time that is spent in interaction with the child on the parent's part or the caretaker's part is related to economic or socioeconomic status. The other piece is that type of language exposure is also linked to IQ test performance. And this IQ performance can be, the influence, I should say, on IQ test performance can start as young as at the age of 3. So we start to see these kind of influences of impoverishment on children's language acquisition and development. I should say that children from poor families, the parents, I should say, of poor families tend to show significantly less interactions, including speech, with their children than parents from more affluent families. Now, the reasons for this correlation between family affluence and the frequency of children being spoken to or read to, that's another issue, in the home can be due to lots of different factors. One is that more affluent parents probably have more time to spend with their children, and they have more flexible work hours because of the kind of jobs that they have. And also, they tend to have less household chores, and therefore they tend to be less physically exhausted, and so they have more energy to spend with their kids. There's also an increasing body of evidence that suggests that family income and poverty can impact a child's general cognitive development as well. And research shows longitudinally now, it's not just a one time where they look at this and they have this kind of cross-sectional or correlational relationship where, okay, this is related to that, but we can't determine whether there's another factor that's related to why these two, A and B are related, or whether A comes first or B comes first or what have you. With longitudinal research, we can start to tease out those relationships, whether A precedes B, or maybe there's factor C that precedes A and B, etc. But this longitudinal research about poverty and cognitive development shows that the longer children live in poverty, the more severe the effects of poverty on cognitive development. That is, there are greater limitations, due to greater limitations in educational resources and less psychological support from parents or teachers or other caregivers for a child, the poorer or the slower the cognitive and language development. Those are linked together. We're not going to talk about Head Start in this lecture, but we will be talking about it later in the semester, about the research as to the importance of Head Start, particularly for children who are in environments of long-term poverty. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to cover was English language learners, bilingual education versus immersion, etc., etc. What about bilingual education? Bilingual education basically has started primarily due to immigration, Children who come to the country and have another language, another major language that they speak. And so bilingual education is a process in which children learn in both languages, learn in English as a way of teaching them the language, and then also to provide support, help children to learn better by also using their native language. English language learners, these are students who enter school with little or no English proficiency. Now, this has been a case well over 150 years, where we have people coming here with their children who do not speak English as their first language. So this is not a new experience. It's experience that's been going on for quite some time. Educators have very different opinions about whether there should be full immersion, that is, children are not given, nothing is taught in the child's language at all. They're fully and immediately immersed in English and are given support to catch up in their ability to understand the language to that of native speakers. And this has basically been, my understanding is historically that's the approach that has been used in the United States. Then we have the bilingual approach, which I've already mentioned. So we have what is called immersion, and then we have what is called bilingual education. Okay. There's also bilingual informal education when children are raised in homes in which two languages or more are spoken. It is possible, for example, that the parents of the children are bilingual themselves, or one parent speaks one language more proficiently and another parent speaks another language proficiently. Now, both parents are able to speak both languages, but one may be more proficient in one language as opposed to the other, and the child is exposed to both of those languages in an early, from birth, let's say, from infancy. And so they grow up bilingual, essentially. Research shows that bilingual children who are bilingual may have some cognitive advantages to monolingual children. One is they have greater cognitive flexibility. They also tend to have higher self-esteem, which I think is interesting, because one would think that if one is bilingual and maybe they might feel a bit odd because they speak another language, especially in a country like the U.S., where we are very monolingual in our approach to language. Children who are bilingual also tend to have greater metalinguistic awareness. They understand the rules of language more explicitly than students who speak only one language. Why? Because they have to learn the grammar of a second language and then learn the grammar of a first language. They're learning the grammar of both because grammar is not universal across languages. So it's important to know the grammar of both languages. Also, they tend to have higher scores on IQ tests, according to at least some research. Also, there's some research that shows that instruction in a native language, at least initially, may enhance the instruction in a second language. Now, that's a bit controversial. In America, when we're teaching, let's say, high schoolers or young children to learn, let's say, they're monolingual, their first language is English, and we want them to learn a second language. The way we approach it is to use our language, English language, to then teach them a second language. In other countries, if you go to Europe, for example, they use the immersion process. That is, they start immediately by teaching you and speaking to you only in that language. Maybe the materials might be in the first language. In this case, it would be English. But nonetheless, the approach is relatively is using immersion. I really like this slide. We have a Latina adolescent. She's kind of looking up. English, Espanol, Spanglish. We have, in the United States, have a very interesting phenomenon occurring with Spanglish, where we have young adults, teenagers who are bilingual, and they mix and match. That's my use, my terminology, I should say. They mix and match both languages to then kind of speak this almost third version called Spanglish. And in fact, if one were to go to Los Angeles, for example, there's at least now one TV channel, if not two, that is Spanglish. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. Okay, that is our lecture on language development and some of the basic ideas about language. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk with you again next week.